We're at the Miami Book Fair International inside the BookTV bus with Donna Gehrke-White. She's the author of this book, The Face Behind the Veil, The Extraordinary Lives of Muslim Women in America. When did you first start learning about the lives of Muslim women here?
It was right after 9/11, and my editors wanted to find out, what are our Muslims like? And then I got really fascinated, and I wrote a book out of it.
Where do you write?
I work for the Miami Herald.
Mm-hmm. And what kind of things were they looking for? What kind of stories were they looking for?
Well, basically, we just needed to know about Muslims because we didn't really know. We hadn't really covered it until after 9/11. So I went at it. I asked Muslims, and they said, you know what? You should look at the women because there's this trend that some are returning to the veil, even though most in the United States are believed not to wear any kind of covering. Mm-hmm. So I did, and I found them fascinating. But my agent said, well, you can write this book, but you're going to have to look at all the different kinds of Muslim women, and so not just the women who wear the veil. And that's what I did, and it was fascinating.
How did you find them?
Well, it was really strange. Email, chat rooms. Muslims, one of the ways that it's very effective is that they can go on the internet now, and they can even buy clothes on the internet. They can be much more part of their faith than you would imagine. So you've got women in South Dakota who are Muslims, and a lot of them are converts, by the way, which was another surprise for my book. About 30%, I would say, are converts in the United States.
How does one convert to being a Muslim, to Islam?
Well, you go through a ceremony, but first of all, you have to decide that you want to. It's not an easy process because you're giving up a lot of culture in America, especially after 9/11. But many of my women have converted after 9/11 because they feel that Islam fits them better than, say, Christianity. And the main thing I found is they have a problem with Jesus as being the Son of God. They are content that Jesus is a prophet, and they're much more comfortable with that.
And what is it about the cultural side of being a Muslim woman that they like?
Well, they like the family aspect of it, that a man, if he is a good Muslim, and that's the important word, if he's a good Muslim, supports the family. And the woman can earn money. She's encouraged to have a career, but it's the man who has the responsibility for the income. So, for example, Dr. Hack, who's in the North Fort Lauderdale area, she practices part-time as a doctor. She has a his and her doctor's practice. Her husband sees the men, she sees the women, but she has much more flexibility to raise the children. So the family aspect is really important, I would say.
Was it difficult to get into their lives, to find out about them? Did they not want you to, or why?
Well, it's so funny that you would say that. I flew out all the way to Las Vegas and had a great time interviewing some women there. Then I drove to Phoenix. I went to my interview, and the first thing is, why are you interested in this? So I had to go through an interview for them to trust me, and that was the important part, is trust, because they felt abused by the media. So you're right, it was not exactly easy. Here I am, a journalist, I work for the Miami Herald, and they felt that the media was misportraying them. So that became part of the book, is I promised to give a view of them as they see themselves, an accurate view.
Besides the problem with the media, what else do they feel as that makes them apprehensive about being open about their religion?
You know what, it was very interesting. One of them said, you know what, I'm a first generation immigrant. We're not used to talking about our faith to people, especially publicly. But now they realize that they have to, because that has been one of the main criticisms of Americans is, one, they're not denouncing terrorism, and two, they're not talking about how good America has been for them, especially to the rest of the Muslim world. So that's changing. They're becoming much more active. Now, the second generation of Muslim women are much more vocal, much more willing to give interviews, but it's the first generation that often is, frankly, more afraid, I would say.
What is the determinant of whether or whether not to wear the veil?
You know what? It's how you interpret the Quran and other Islamic writings. The Quran and other Islamic writings are adamant that women have to be modest. They must wear clothes that are modest. The women that I interviewed who do wear some sort of covering interpret that as to mean that their hair is covered. The women who do not feel that they can wear long sleeves, pants, rather shapeless clothing, and that fits the modesty requirement. But I have to tell you that they want people to know that they are just as religious as women who do wear some sort of covering.
Oh, so they feel that they have to explain themselves?
Yeah, yeah, and sometimes they feel stared at by other women who do wear the veil. But I've also sensed that these women feel trying to bond together regardless of whether or not. In other words, they don't want a veil war. So
you have some photos, and we've shown one already. Can you introduce us to some of the people in the book?
Yeah, they're really great women. The one is Deidre Aboud, and she's head of a state organization in Florida, Muslim organization. Now, what's interesting about Deidre is that she grew up in Arkansas in a fundamentalist church, and she was very much against Islam and told them that they were going to hell. But then they gave her literature, and she became hooked on Islam, and so she eventually converted. She went to, I have to tell you, she went to Arizona because she felt it'd be more comfortable. She wanted to wear the covering, as you see. Now, her friend, her best friend, who's right next to her.
Is it this woman? Or
the next woman, Yuko Davis. She's a Japanese American, and she grew up in rural Louisiana. Grew up in another fundamentalist church. But then one day, she was told that she was a volunteer at the church bus and that they would no longer be picking up African American children. And she felt that she could not be part of that because here she is, a Japanese American, a woman of color herself. And they kept telling her, no, you're okay. But she eventually left the church and became a Muslim.
What role, now that you brought up African Americans, what role do African American women play in terms of converting or being Muslim?
No, very important role. A lot of African Americans can trace, become very interested in Islam because of their, of course, African connections. There are a lot of Muslims in Africa, and there's a feeling that perhaps 10 to 30% of our slaves that came over here were Muslim, but they were forced to become Christians. So in a way, they're going back to their original faith. Now, some of the most successful women, Muslim women, are African Americans. They're converts. In Baltimore, the first Muslim woman believed to be a judge is in Baltimore. And then this woman that you see, Okola Rashid, she started the first Muslim museum in America. It's in Jackson, Mississippi, of all places.
Does she run it or she just started it?
She started it, and she's the director.
Also interested in the woman on the other side of this picture, of this page. The woman
The
seated,
insert.
the designer.
Yeah, Michaela. She lives out in the Seattle area. She's another convert, and she sells her designs on eBay and on other internet sites, and she's been quite successful. She has clients all over the country, so she has done quite well for herself.
And what does she try to do in this? Is she trying to update the Muslim veil?
No, what she wants is, it's not only the veil, but it's, like I said, they're required to have some rather shapeless clothing. So what she tries to do, what she says in the book, is she tries to Americanize what these women wear. So as you can see, it's not like how Pakistanis or Indians or Saudi women would wear clothing, but rather American. Notice in her that vivid yellow with the maroon. It's very distinctly American, and yet it fits the requirements for modesty. And then notice her colors. She uses blue, she uses pink, and it's the whole idea of Americanizing Islam.
How many Muslim women are there in the United States?
I would say about 3 million, because we believe about 6 million total Muslims, and we know this from the Canadian census. Canada does ask on its census what the religion is. For the first time in 2001, Islam became the #2 religion in Canada. So they have about 2%. So if we calculate that 2% times 300 million, which we have now, that's 6 million Muslims.
You wrote in your book that Muslim women were many times passed over in surveys and polls that were done. Why is that?
Because many of the women, especially the first generation, they're coming from India and Pakistan and other countries, it's not their tradition to go to the mosque. Traditionally, the mosque in other countries have been a place for prayer, mostly, to be honest, for men. Now here in America, again, it's Americanizing Islam. The mosque has become much more like a church or a synagogue. It's like they have brownie troops, they have self-help groups, you know, Alcoholics Anonymous. It's just like a church. And in fact, some of the African Americans, they're so involved and they're so used to their Sunday service that they will have Sunday services as well as the traditional Friday.
Who's this woman?
This is Dalia Hashad. She's one of my, she's totally great. She is an attorney, a civil rights attorney. She worked for the ACLU at first. She now works for Amnesty International, and she tries to help Muslims with their civil rights right now in the United States.
And this woman?
That's Farida, and she has an amazing story. She's from Afghanistan. She had to escape from her husband. He wanted her to stay in Afghanistan, but she felt the future was in America, where she was able to get papers to come here, and her 2 sons. So she, at one point, hid in a burqa and hid her sons under the burqa so that they could escape into Pakistan to go once to make their way to America.
How about this woman right here?
This is a very famous woman. This is Ingrid Mattson. She's now the president of the Islamic Society of North America. That's the largest Islamic group in North America.
As a woman, not a women organization, the whole.
Yeah. That's what amazes people, because there's this perception that Islam discriminates against women, but she shows, at least in her case, that they don't. She is president. She is the leader of the Islamic Society of North America. She is a professor at a seminary, at the Hartford Seminary. Interestingly enough, she graduated from the University of Chicago with a PhD, and she got help from her husband. Again, this is a perception that women are discriminated against. Her husband, an engineer, became kind of like Mr. Mom so that she could earn her PhD.
And the woman on the other side over here started wearing the veil, I think, after an incident in her family?
Yeah, this was very sad. This is Serene. She's out in Los Angeles. And what happened was her uncle, you know, typical immigrant, he was driving a taxi to support his family, and he was shot in the head and murdered. And up till that point, Serene had not worn any kind of covering, but after that, she felt compelled to wear a hijab. And this is her version. I think it's a very stylish version, and she's not taking it off.
What are the politics of Muslim women that you found? I mean, can you?
Most are Democrats. The polls have shown, and especially after 9/11, they felt their civil rights have been trampled on. In fact, I was at a religious conference, and one of my women, Dr. Layla Al-Maradi, said, you know what, we're taking the problems of America, and we're the ones who are being discriminated against. We're the ones that are being watched, and they feel very strongly about this.
Who's this?
Well, this is one of my favorites. This is Zainab Elberry, and as it turns out, we share a birthday. We found that out later. But she has an inspirational story. She lives in Nashville, has lived there most of her adult life, went there at Vanderbilt because she loved Tennessee Williams. So she became very entranced with Nashville and stayed. She became an insurance entrepreneur. She was a single mom, had a hard time. It was in the early 70s, but she made it. She has now a successful business.
You say that she's an activist in the Democratic Party?
Yes.
Here, according to...
Yes. She worked very vigorously for Vice President Al Gore, and to this day is sad that he didn't make it.
I want to show this last one here, because you make a point of talking about her being a Latina.
Yeah, this is Zuli Martinez. Zuli is wonderful. She's a photographer. She's in Houston. She doesn't always wear the covering now because she feels it distracts from her work as a photographer, that people are drawn to her because of that, and not necessarily in a good way. Now, one of the funny things is, of course, Zuli, as a Mexican American, understands Spanish, and so in the early days after 9/11, when she was still wearing a covering, and she still wears one on occasion, she would be accosted by these other Mexican Americans who would be speaking Spanish, saying, "Look, there's the wife of Osama bin Laden," or "There's a Taliban woman." So she'd turn to them in Spanish and say, "Look, I'm one of you. I just happen to be a Muslim," and they would be totally freaked out. So they hastily retreated, I guess is the word to say.
Did you find any activist Muslim women who were more on the radical side?
Radical in the sense of
violence, anti-Americanism, anything like that?
No, and in fact, who we just saw earlier is Yuko Davis, because what she says is that most Muslims are what they call mainstream. They actually say words like mainstream Muslim. A mainstream Muslim, the way you can tell for a man is that he will shake a woman's hand. And when I was in Las Vegas, I was going to an interview at an Islamic center, and the man would not shake my hand. He covered his hand with his sweater to reach out to me, because then as an American woman, automatically I was going to shake his hand, introduce myself, and say I'm waiting for a woman. Well, that totally freaked me out. I felt very strange. And so they later said that she and Deidre teach the men to shake women's hands. They don't realize that this will be considered very rude.
Employment and how they are treated in the workplace. What did you find out about the women you interviewed?
Well, most feel like they've been treated very well in America, but there have been incidents. One woman, again, this one in Arizona, she went 9 months looking for a job, and she came highly educated. She's a software engineer. She couldn't find a job, and she thought, oh, well, it's my hijab. This is keeping me from getting a job.
She would wear that to the interview.
Yeah, she made that choice because she felt it was so part of her that she couldn't give it up. So she then interviewed with this large company, turned out to be Boeing, and she got a call on Friday saying, "We've decided to hire you. When can you start?" So she was afraid that they would take it away, so she said, "I'll start Monday." And she has, and she's worked there for years and years now. And I want to say Boeing has been very flexible, allowed her to work part-time when she felt that she needed to spend more time with her children.
You also discuss leadership positions in the mosque taken by women in this country. Is it fairly common for women to have any leadership positions?
It's becoming more common, but I have to tell you, it is a problem. And I guess we could say that with Christianity too. Look at the Catholic Church, where it's all men who lead it. But Ingrid Mattson, again, she's the president of the Islamic Society, And the Muslims realize they have to reach out and to so-called Americanize and include more women.
Donna Gehrke-White writes for the Miami Herald, and as part of that, her reporting, she turned it into this book, which is called The Face Behind the Veil, The Extraordinary Lives of Muslim Women in America. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.